Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Andrea Goulet is on a mission to operationalize empathy for tech teams. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Empathy-Driven Software Development, has co-founded several successful technology companies, is the host of the podcast Legacy Code Rocks, and has taught over 50,000 students how to turn soft skills like empathy and communication into software skills. Andrea joins us from Ashland, Virginia in the United States. Andrea Goulet, welcome to Maintainable. We're so delighted to have you join us.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you. I absolutely love geeking out about legacy code and maintainability. It's so much fun. So I'm glad to be here.
I had a hunch that might be the case. So as you reflect on your experience in our industry, what do you believe are a few characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
The thing that I've landed on is that it really comes down to trust. So, kind of the commonly accepted definition of legacy code is from Michael Feathers, and he describes it as code without tests in his book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, which is amazing and a great read. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I think that is accurate, yet incomplete, because there are a lot of other places within the code that we need to pay attention to. So I describe it as code without trust. We don't trust our tools. We don't trust that the code's going to execute the way that we think it will. We don't trust our team members. We don't trust the organization even. Sometimes, we think of the business and that they don't have our best interests in mind. And so I think well-maintained code is when all of those things are working together and when, it's working as a system. And the key measurement of whether or not that system is effective is trust, and then the benefit and kind of the outcome is that we have resilient and, sustainable systems that are able to respond to the dynamism of market conditions, updates and changes and all sorts of different things.
How would someone listening, how would they know whether or not there's enough trust or not? Is it trusting their peers, or just I'm a little bit of a skeptic about things, so I don't always trust that everything's going to go well, or things, I'm always kind of like, if it happens, great. And then that'll be a great day if everything goes to plan. But I'm always like, a little cautious. So for anyone listening that might also feel that way, how do you delineate that?
Yeah, I think, there was, I think Ronald Reagan had this quote of trust but verify. And I'm a yes and person, so I think trust and verify. It's great to be skeptical. We need to be skeptical. Blind trust is not what we're going for here. We're not saying just accept everything and never question it. But we're saying that we've built relationships within our teams where I know and I can predict with a degree of accuracy kind of how things would go. Either that's a conversation with a peer, or it's, I'm going to execute the code and there's not some random bug in a, a different part of the system that randomly crops up, but that, things are relatively predictable. And, I think that doesn't come easily. There is a level of kind of certainty that we have to let go of, because all of this comes down to really looking at things more as a system and less of a kind of linear, I am going to do this, and then I am going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. But in terms of the amount of measurement, that is one of those fuzzy metrics, right? Like you can do surveys of within your organization, but really I think it comes down to kind of these small and fleeting moments where it's either a level of frustration or a level of freedom, where it's like, okay, the tests are passing. I feel good about that. Or, oh, this is so annoying. Why would somebody do it this way? So I think measuring your own, making it more of an internal metric of kind of how frustrated you are, and then observing, where does that frustration lie? Is it with other people on the team? Is it with the code base itself? And then you can start to look at where you might want to start addressing some of those concerns. And again, that's not to replace all the code quality metrics and stuff. We still want to measure cyclomatic complexity and churn and all of that and look at all of those metrics. But in terms of an individual and where you can make an impact, I think when we can teach people how to do that effectively, and the approach that I take is through teaching empathy on a very technical level, I think then we can start to move in the direction of resilience without having to do this big top-down approach. It tends to be more bottom-up, and it's these small interactions.
Yeah, I always think about environments or in organizations where there's a lot of responsibility. I feel like managers of people or leadership in an organization is like, what can we do to make things better for our people? And oftentimes they're trying to problem solve that issue or whatever, like how can we make these things better? But oftentimes I think there's a lot of literature suggesting that you're saying it needs to be more bottom up. Like how can they improve their own situation and their peers' situation, and then that bubble up into the leadership as well. And so there's an interesting dance that I think both sides of that spectrum to kind of like figure out a way to do that together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm not saying that it's just software developers, right? Like I think it was Edward Demings who said a good individual is no match for a bad system, right? If you're in an environment that makes it hard, then it's going to be really hard. But what's really interesting around empathy is that more increasingly in 2014, there's a researcher, his name's Dr. Jamil Zaki, and he's out in Stanford. And he put forth a motivated model of empathy. And really, it comes down to empathy avoidance and empathy approach, right? This is kind of how we look at modulating behaviors. And in a real world kind of setting, the example I give is that early in my career, I would use alt tags, and I didn't really have a sense of kind of how they were used. Like I knew in general but it was a check the box activity for me. It was theoretically someone might find this helpful someday. And so what happened, and this aligns with the model, was that my own self-interests, which isn't bad, we all are operating in our own self-interests. I was under time pressure. It wasn't seen as a priority in my organization. And it was just skip them. They're no big deal. But then I had a friend, Taylor, who was in a car accident and he lost his vision. And talking to him about just how important they were, it opened my understanding and all of a sudden I had emotional connection to this thing that was abstract and I didn't think it was super important. And when I got to that moment of what should I do with an alt tag, I thought of my friend Taylor and I was like, how can I write something for Taylor that's going to be useful? And now, because I'm doing that every single time I approach an alt tag, my code is better, right? And so we have those small interaction points of how do I write an error message? How do I write a test? Do I even write a test? What's my commit message going to look like? Do I even, write a description, or do I just, name a variable foo and bar, or do we try to make it intention revealing? Like there are so many teeny, tiny little moments within our world and within everyone else's world. So when we're thinking about, an executive, it's, what values am I going to lead this organization with? When we're looking at, people who control the budgets, it's, am I going to try to think of things and get the cheapest tool, or am I going to listen to my engineers and say, no, if I had a faster and better equipment, I would be able to do so much better. And so that's where the trust comes in, because rather than having it combative as an us versus them, it's everybody working together so that systemically we can be investing in resources and cultures and practices that actually serve to create code that's more maintainable, more marketable, more useful, all of that.
I appreciate you digging into that and sharing those examples. You were mentioning the alt tag, and I had this flashback to I feel like we just used to just stuff those with SEO related type things. I don't know, because we didn't always know what people were going to be uploading into an app. And then let's say you had a blog and you have an image in a blog post. You're like, I don't know, it's a photo or an image. We'll put the title of the article there. I don't know. Yeah, we've since learned a lot more about how that's not super helpful. Maybe a little bit better than just the file name. But having said that, but you mentioned commit messages as a good example, or what we name things in our code bases. And trust, and I think that's an interesting way to think about it, is like, how can we trust that what we're changing is doing the thing that we're, without needing to get like a full deep dive of the code base. And it's always one of those things in the PR review process, I suppose, that if things look a little confusing to you, if you're reviewing someone's code or it doesn't seem super obvious, and I like the phrasing of you used of internal or intentionally revealing. I really like that. I'm going to reflect on that a little bit more, but that's just interesting thinking about, does this method name convey what it's doing, and could 30 more seconds of thinking about it actually make a big difference in the future? Yeah.
And I think it's just being conscious. It's being aware of that, right? And that's why empathy is such a great skill to learn, because it's like breathing, right? It arises unconsciously in many situations, but we have immense control. And we can choose avoidance strategies and we can choose to create our cultures, right, in a urgent hero culture, right, where that's going to dissuade those types of, okay, let me think about this. Let me take a little bit of extra time, right? Or we can lean towards it. And so by just even recognizing, like, and even things like, am I being prone to my optimism bias right now when I'm communicating a timeline, right? And then how is that going to show up later? It's these tiny little moments where then it impacts our communication. And so I think the measurement of the amount of trust in the system is something that you can gauge internally. But like doing the empathy-driven development, it's very much an internal practice, because no one's going to really see you do this. But the neat thing there is that you don't need anybody's permission. You can start doing this right now. You don't have to go to your boss and say, I think I would like to start, coding with a little bit more empathy. Like, you can just start. So
it's true.
That can be fairly empowering.
Do you use the metaphor technical debt very often?
I do in certain contexts. So I do when I'm in the world of software remodeling and people who like philosophizing about that. I don't find that it's a very useful metaphor when I'm describing it with people who are business minded. And I went to business school. And I think kind of one of the challenges there is the way that a lot of people who run businesses think about debt. Because when we're using the term technical debt, we're really thinking about it more in terms of personal debt, like how we run a household. Like, we don't want a lot of credit card debt. But debt can be a lot of leverage when it comes to larger investments and businesses. So I don't know that, when we're communicating to larger organizations or the people who are making the financial decisions, that it can kind of sometimes create a little bit more confusion. So that's why I tend to frame things more in the positive. So thinking about it in terms of code health, right? Like, how healthy is the code base? And then, like, this is what we use at Corgi Bytes too. So we start like building metaphors around that. So like, you have code hygiene, right? You need to update dependencies, right? You need to, make sure your passwords are encrypted. You need to make sure that your code is in source control, like those kind of basic things. And then when you are at optimum health, like, it's to achieve some kind of goal. So instead of tying it to this idea of debt, which can be a little confusing, it's more about like, what is the business outcome that you want to achieve? And then how can we look at the code base to achieve those outcomes? Because that's going to drive the majority of the decisions in how we modify or improve, a code base.
Do you feel like your own understanding or the way you think about technical debt, or even maybe amongst the people on your team, has evolved? And you feel like there is a period where you might have used it to describe something that you wouldn't now think is technical debt?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's kind of how I stumbled on this. I actually had a conversation at a conference with a CEO who gave me that insight about, like, I don't think about debt as a bad thing. I think of it as a good thing because that gives me leverage to go build another company. Oh, I didn't know that. So, definitely and I think that it's a good way to just think about it. But more, I think it's about the impact of the debt, right? And it's about what are you able to do? And in a personal household, right, where the metaphor kind of starts from, it's that I won't be able to achieve the things that I want to achieve, right? And that's where the disconnect comes in. And so then, well, I think it was Declan Whelan, who at a conference talked about the technical debt snowball, right? And so like we can start to learn to kind of pay down some of that debt by making these decisions in a consistent way. But the way that we do that typically isn't like when Scott and I first started, he just has a passion for, paying down technical debt. I remember one of the very first clients that we had, he was showing the client and it was like, look, we have 2% more test coverage. And the client was angry because he wasn't able to link why that mattered. And so I think that's the big key, is that we can use metaphors, but if they don't work, then, really at the end of the day, they're abstractions to help us communicate well. But what we're trying to get to is an understanding of shared goals and being able to describe, here's a technical choice I want to make. This is why it matters to achieving your goals.
Hi there. Do you know someone who might be looking for assistance with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon would love to meet them. We're offering a $1,000 referral bonus. Send someone our way, and if they sign up for services with Planet Argon, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And in return, you'll get a check for $1,000 in the mail, just for knowing the right person. Hop on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more information and to refer someone our way. That's planetargon.com/referrals. Thanks.
For those listening that might be thinking like, oh yeah, like I raise some issues from time to time with the team or the product owner or the business, I'm air quoting the business people, like, well, if we do this, it would speed up our development pipelines or deployments time or our ability to turn things around. But maybe they haven't felt like they've not gotten a thumbs up on like doing those projects. Do you feel like there's often like a challenge for people to think about how to best frame it for the particular audience that's going to maybe give them a thumbs up to do it?
Yeah, I think the first step is to really understand, do you have shared goals? Because where I've seen that fail is that, like, for example, if there is something that needs to get to market really fast, right? Because it's more of a prototype or, it's more in the startup phase. I've seen a lot of tension because people who, it's like, we need to start generating revenue from this thing as fast as possible. Yes, it's not going to be perfect, but something that is shippable is going to be better for our situation than something that is not shippable and perfect and, has 100% code coverage and all of that. And so what I see is that a lot of times developers end up arguing on points that are based on their goals and what their perceived value of the business is. So my suggestion always is to figure out, like, what is the thing that we are jointly trying to achieve? And that can be with your product owner, it can be with your CTO or whatever. And really thinking about it like, hey, Robby, like, you're the CTO. All right, I want to make sure that I'm super clear on what your goals are for this quarter. Like, what are the needs of the business? Because I want to make sure that I'm aligning my technical decisions to make sure that we're achieving that goal as quickly as possible. That's a powerful statement, because then it's like we're on the same team and it's not combative. And then you listen, right? And so when you learn, okay, this is kind of our goal, then you can start to dialogue and you can start to have negotiation around, okay, awesome, I have that goal too. An idea that I had to help us reach that goal faster is this. It's not intuitive, but if you start with the goal statements and you start with those, like, what are we trying to achieve, then you have much more
leverage.
Yeah, much more leverage, exactly.
I'm imagining that some people listening maybe they're part of a large development team. And so maybe they're a few tiers or a few steps away from having regular interactions with, again, the business people, product team, and what have you. So for those people that are kind of like maybe feeling like they're a few steps away from that and have never asked these types of goal questions of senior leadership or the organization, because they just assume this information should be flowing to them. Like, it's up to leadership to convey all these goals, and then we'll deal with it. So it's like I should be receiving them as a developer, not going out and soliciting them, because that's not my job to understand what the direction of the business is. Just tell me what I should be focusing on in terms of what's next in the backlog or something. So what do you say to folks like that? Because I'm imagining consulting world, we might have a little bit.
If you're in a large organization, there is somebody who is like on your team, or like it doesn't have to be you go to the CFO, but there's probably a team lead or a pairing partner, or even like a business analyst who is on your team, who you have coined as the business. Get to know them, right? Take them to lunch and say, hey, Jerry, what is your job like? What do you need to do? And I think that then it can be really disempowering when you're a ticket taker. And that's no fun. And I think this is, again, it comes to the alt tag piece, where it's like, if we resign ourselves to be only ticket takers and to only take direction as it's given and to take no ownership and to basically just defer the decision-making to other people, I think that's irresponsible. I think that leads up to ethics questions, right? And there's a philosopher, Mario Bruhe, who actually has a paper on this. It's on Techno Ethics. And it's like, we can't hide behind other people. If we differentiate this, like this is where a lot of the problems in software come from. So taking ownership and saying, I need to understand what's going on, and recognizing that is part of your job. If you look at like the IEEE like competency models that they're putting out about what a successful developer looks like, it's all of these skills, right? It's not just slinging code. So the goal there is learn, get curious. And the best thing is like I hear people say, I'm an introvert. Awesome. Ask questions. Listen. That's great. Like I was in sales. I started my career in sales and marketing. And the best salespeople don't talk all the time. They don't pitch. Those are used car salesmen. They're sleazy. The best salespeople understand what people need and then act as problem solvers to help be a bridge. And so there's another people who like to geek out. I forget the name of the person, but there's the concept of structural holes. And so for your career growth, if you can be a knowledge broker between different departments, then you are acquiring more knowledge. You are able to form more connections. You have more personal satisfaction, and you become more valuable to the organization too.
I think that's some really good advice there for folks listening. And I keep thinking around like these larger team scenarios, which I've only had like one stint where I've worked with like a team of like around 20 developers. So I've never been in a part of a project that ever needed more than that. And I don't know what your experience is in that space, but when I do talk to companies that do have those types of situations, I hear things from like engineering managers like, well, there's a lot of like people come here and they want to do their job and call it a day. And like they saw this was a good career thing. They weren't necessarily like, I'm air quoting, passionate about being good software developers. Like, yeah, I could write some code and take tickets and do things like that. And so that's my job. It's just to help move the thing forward, tell me what to focus on, make it as simple as possible for me. And so it's an interesting kind of paradigm of like, also like, we need everybody to kind of step up too. And like,
well, and I think I want to be clear too. I don't think that this means that you have to go and like spend all of your free time when you're not working on open source projects and like, I think that's a different thing. I think you can go to work and do your job, and that you don't have to be required to do all of this extra stuff. Have a family, like set boundaries. All of that is really good and healthy. But I do think that just kind of resigning yourself and never questioning. Now, certainly there are cultures where there will be pushback. 100%, right? Because they have set themselves up in terms of their organizational systems, that's just not the norm, right? And so I think some of it is just recognizing and looking at the organization that you're in. I really struggled personally because I'm somebody who craves fast feedback loops, and I like want to see my ideas implemented as fast as possible. And I don't have a lot of patience for really politicking and learning about a lot of different things. And so, but I have an aunt that's her, like, that's what she's really good at, is she's really good at learning about all of the different facets and then putting together something that's more comprehensive that reflects back, here are the needs of everyone else. And so it could, and for her, a project sometimes took a year before she had gathered all of that information. Whereas for me, I really struggled on large teams because it was, here's an idea and I want it right now. Blah, 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 blah. I also have ADHD, so that's that's a contributing factor there. And so I think some of it is recognizing what environment you're going to be best in. And so for me, being in startup world is just a better fit for me, because when I was in large organizations, I frustrated everyone around me, and then I was frustrated too. But there most certainly are ways, just talking to people, getting to know them, and recognizing that you don't have to conform to the stereotype that a software developer is antisocial and doesn't have social skills and doesn't have empathy, because that is patently false. It is false. The research does not back it up at all.
As I'm sitting here, like, reflecting on some of this, I'm thinking, what about for people they're interviewing at places? Do you think there's some good types of questions they might be able to ask? Let's just assume that they might be getting a chance to speak to, like, an engineering manager, and potentially at least an interview with a few people that they would be working on as peers. Maybe some advice on what sorts of questions they should be asking in those to kind of get a feel out if this is going to be an environment that works well for them.
Well, yeah, I think first of all is taking ownership there as well. You are interviewing a company just as much as they are interviewing you, and recognizing that you have choice. You know, especially in this industry, there is a huge demand for our skill sets, right? So, and especially now in this market with unemployment being so low. Now, there are definitely things where different people are getting laid off and people are moving around, and that's always going to happen. But when you approach finding a new job as, what do I want? What environment am I going to thrive in, right? Then the questions are going to become evident, because it's, what do you value? And so, you know, it's not going to be the same for everyone, right? But you can ask situational questions, like that you can research, you know, motivational techniques for how to frame questions in terms of situations. So I always like to hear, like, when I interview folks, I love it when people ask me, like, tell me about a time that you had a challenging client and how did you handle it? And asking those interviewers, and I would argue that the places where people are probably going to be happiest are going to be where that's appreciated. Because I interview a lot of people, and then when I get, nope, I don't have any questions, like, they don't stand out. The people who have put thought into, like, this is what matters to me, and this is what I want to do. How does your company align with that? Like, that stands out. And again, this is an internal thing. It's a identity switch where you're not passive. You are an active participant in your life. And without sounding all, you know, kind of woo-woo, right? This is how we get to maintainable code. Because if you're not able to dissent, if you're not able to engage in healthy conflict, then you're deferring decisions to other people. And software developers have a unique perspective because they see things in the code that are risks. And if you aren't in an environment where you can have those conversations, then bad things happen.
We'll be back with our interview with Andrea in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please share a link amongst your peers and or write a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Also, do you know someone in the industry that I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview with Andrea Goulet. For anyone listening, what is empathy? Like, is that feelings about things? Like, can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so I'm writing a book, and one of the chapters is It's Not You, Empathy is Confusing. So one of the really interesting things is that the dictionaries sometimes, they get it wrong. And so the way I frame it is that there's a colloquial understanding of empathy and there's a technical understanding of empathy. Just like how with coding, there are colloquial understandings of things and there are technical understandings of things. So I'll frame that in the code world first. When I was first learning how to code, Scott had kind of found me. He's like, wow, you have a systems brain and like you will be great at this. And so I was just learning. We went and picked out some stuff and we had been using the terms programming and coding interchangeably. And if you look in the dictionary, they're basically like writing instructions for a computer. They have very, very, very similar definitions. And so I was working on HTML, CSS, and I told Scott, I was like, I really think I'm getting the hang of this programming thing. And his response was, you're not programming, because I was using declarative languages. And so he's like, you have to initiate a state change. And I was like, whoa, what is this? Right. So I think the same thing happens. He was absolutely accurate. And the difference in that and why there was tension, because it really deflated my confidence. And Scott's intention was not at all. He's like, no, you're learning. And here's an opportunity to deepen your understanding. Was that I was operating from a colloquial understanding, he was operating from a technical understanding. So we have the same thing that happens with empathy. We tend to think that empathy is walking in someone else's shoes, right? That's what we think of. And in fact, if you look at the Cambridge Dictionary, theirs is the ability to share someone else's feelings and experiences by imagining what it would be in that person's situation. But here's the problem. That's not empathy. That's actually projection. And so imagining your experiences in someone else's reality is where we get bias. It's where we get discrimination. It's where we get prejudice. It's where we get discomfort. And so there's actually quite a bit in the literature around just how confusing empathy is, because researchers use different terminology, and some people say sympathy, and some people say empathic concern, and some people say this. And so the field is becoming more nuanced, it's becoming more technical, and we are just at the nexus of that right now. So to answer your question, from looking at all of the different things, the way that I define empathy is there's a compassion-motivated, multidimensional, and individualized system of skills and abilities, which helps you accurately understand the emotional and mental states of yourself and of others, communicate effectively, and act in a way that helps more and harms less. And that's long, but to me, that feels accurate because there's a lot in there, because empathy depends on motivation, right? Empathy is a lot of freaking work. It's metabolically expensive, right? It needs to be worth it. We need to guard ourselves against burnout, right? And so the way that we do that is through compassion. It's multidimensional, so there are a lot of different things going on. It's like we have to, there's a great researcher, his name is John DeCity, he's in Canada. He's outlined kind of a functional architecture, of empathy. And so there's affective or emotional empathy, which is kind of that emotional synchronization. So if you've ever watched a movie and kind of got swept up with some of the characters, that's kind of that. There's cognitive empathy, which is the ability to recognize somebody else's mental state and incorporate it into your own. So rather than thinking of it as, I'm going to take my experience and plant it into your situation, having it go the other way. There's empathic concern, which is basically caring about people, right? And being motivated to help them. And then there's also another one that has been added recently of emotional regulation. So that is am I able to control my own emotional state to the point where I can then bring stuff in? So I like to approach things in terms of software metaphors. So I think one of the things that's helped me and helped the people on my team is kind of approaching this in a little bit of an algorithm, right? And so we can look at empathy. It's like breathing, there's kind of like an opportunity, right? Oh, okay, I'm writing a commit message, right? Or, oh, there's some friction here, right? There's a lot of little decision points. And so then when we decide we want to engage, first thing in the algorithm I give is care, calm, consider, connect. And so that kind of maps to those 4 different elements. The first is, do I care about this person? Right? And there are some signals there. Like, am I using language that dehumanizes someone? So if I'm referring to someone as the business instead of, no, and this is a genuine thing. There's like psychology behind it. And there's like interesting linguistics about why we do that. But just noticing, oh yeah, wow, I'm referring to them as not their name. I'm not actually thinking about them as a person. How can I change that? Right. And so then there's like loving kindness meditation. There's like a bunch of different things that you can do in terms of skills. Calming, same thing, like being able to notice and name your emotions and kind of think through, like, how do I actually calm myself down to the point where I can listen? Consider is that cognitive aspect. It's that analytical. It's where you get super skeptical, not just about the outside world, but also about yourself. Where are my biases showing up, right? How am I thinking about things? Am I just moving forward, or are there any ethical considerations that I need to think about? You know, do I have good data, or am I operating on data that was collected in a way that might be biased, right? And so just being really skeptical. And then it's like you move towards that emotional connection piece with the confidence that you've kind of gone through a little bit of the process and that it's more pure. Because if we operate based on the projection dictionary definition, what ends up happening is we create more polarization. We entrench an us versus them thinking. And so empathy can be used just as much to harm as it can to help. Because if we have empathy only for people who are like us, then, you know, we're moving away from that opportunity for connection. But at the same time, if we open ourselves too much and we have no boundaries and we allow other people to overtake us, then we're opening ourselves to manipulation and entrenchment and abuse. So it's all about this balance. Yeah, it's a really complex topic, but the thing that I think is the most surprising is that it comes down to motivation. It's not about genetics as much as we think. There's way less of a genetic component, much more of a situational motivation. And that no one is really good at assessing, like in terms of empathic accuracy. So being able to like understand, is somebody like, I'm looking at your facial expressions and I know you. Like the best married couples who have been around each other all the time at best are accurate at 35% of the time. So knowing that, if you're somebody who is like, oh, I'm really bad at empathy and it's like, yeah, no one is. It's something you have to work with and you have to validate. So I think of like that as like TCP/IP. Like I'm not just going to assume that like messages are landing. I'm going to validate like, okay, did the information like reach its destination in the way that I intended, and taking that time. So there are a lot of different ways that we can use software metaphors to kind of increase the understanding and complexity of what empathy is. But at the end of the day, we can deploy empathy and we can execute empathy and we can operationalize empathy in these small moments, and thinking of it in terms of do I want to move towards empathy or do I want to move away from empathy, and trying to work with what we can to control, and recognizing we're not going to be able to impact everything, but we can control what we have within our own experience and domain. So
it sounds like a lot of self-work, and I think that potentially requires a certain level of maturity, I think, in some ways too. I mean, I might be making an assumption there, but it's like it feels like one of those things where you mentioned earlier, like the stereotype. I just want to do my programming. It's very logical job. You know, like you asked for this, I give you that, and of just, you know, great, we're done with this transaction. But to think about all the other nuances of like how we communicate with each other on a team, or send back feedback on someone, how to receive feedback from people. I always feel like that's always one of the really challenging things for people to, or not fear giving people feedback because you don't want to, you're maybe don't lack some confidence that you're really good at it yet. Or you've heard people talk about, like on these podcasts, about like, I need to be empathetic. I'm not. So now I'm like, I think there's probably people out there that are nervous that they're going to cause harm. And so they don't know how to raise topics because they're like,
well, you're going to, everyone is going to, right? And I think there's a difference of like, if you ignore empathy completely, you cause way more harm than getting it wrong in a moment with an interpersonal interaction. And especially like you can build trust. And there's a researcher, his name's John Gottman. So he studies like romantic interpersonal relationships that last a really long time, and can predict like which relationships are going to fail and succeed based on the way that people communicate with each other. And one of the most important things in those relationships, which I think we can also bring here, is that it's not about getting it right all the time. It's about repairing. I messed up. How can I learn? What can I do differently? Right. And then with that, you can create opportunities for co-innovation, right? Like, okay, that didn't work for you. Like, what can I say instead? And a great example here was when I was first learning how to code, I would go up to Sky every once in a while and be like, hey, you got a sec? And I could just tell, like, I stepped in some muck, and it was like, what did I just do? I don't, like, my past experience, that was like how we all interacted with each other. Like, what's different here? And so being able, like, okay, what did I do? How did I mess up? Right? And taking ownership of our mistakes and recognizing, like, this is how you learn. I believe that, like, the stereotype of people in software don't need to have any social skills and shouldn't, right? What that just means is that you haven't learned the skill, right? Whereas somebody like me who's in marketing, like, this is a big part of my degree. Like, I've spent 25 years, like, learning this on a nuanced level. And so just like you learned how to code, you can start to learn some of these skills. And that's what the research is showing us. The research is showing us that the genetic component of empathy is 20 to 25% of the discrepancy. It's not a big amount. It's more about how have things been modeled? What skills have you learned? Like, have you been motivated to even do this? And so by tweaking some of those variables of, like, okay, this is a skill I want to learn. Okay, and it is a skill I can learn, right? And how can I increase my level of motivation? Just like you would with any skill. You know, then you can start to practice, because it's going to be a practice. I mean, that would be like saying, I am scared to learn how to play the piano because I'm going to play a wrong note. And so then you never learn. And so that's why this is a practice. You're going to mess up. There is no such thing as perfect empathy. Everyone messes up, but do you learn from it? Do you grow from it? Do you accept it? You know, your own personal accountability, and then work to rectify things. Do you, as you incorporate new information, do you change course, or do you just sweep it under the rug and say, not my problem? So I would argue that if you are somebody who feels that way, it is very valid to have that fear. It is very valid to have that fear. And so start with why that fear exists, and start small, and start with yourself too. So empathy goes inward as well. So that when I give recommendations, it's start with yourself. Start to learn to have empathy for your own situation and send some compassion your way. Then start with people who are close to you, right? And you'll probably recognize you're way more empathetic than you might give yourself credit for. And I think a part of this too is because we've idolized the idea of empathy just on the same side. So like if we look at a lot of science fiction, empaths are seen as having this like supernatural, superpower psychic ability. That's not what this is either, right? And so if we're only looking to stereotypes to understand what empathy is, and if we're only looking at colloquial understandings, we're missing a whole world of nuance. And I think that's something that developers do really, really well in. Like, we like nuance. We like things on a technical level. We're deeply curious about, like, well, how does this work here? And how does that work here? And the cool thing is that there's so much neuroscience coming out now. It's giving us a whole new perspective on how this works. We're not limited to just observing behaviors anymore. And so there's so much there to just nerd out about, and then try and experiment and learn. So,
you know, you mentioned your book, Empathy-Driven Software Development, and you're probably I'm assuming in the middle of writing that. Or what sort of level developer do you think this would most benefit?
Well, I think that it's not just for software developers. I actually I'll pull up real quick the manuscript, because I have 3 different kind of folks, like different, I guess, audiences, if you will, that I think could benefit from this. And the first is overconfident empaths, which might not be, but this was me. And so, like, I had been told I was an empath my whole life. I was like, oh, I know what empathy is. Empathy is my superpower, blah, blah, blah. But I didn't understand on a deeply technical level that the way that I was assuming and treating those assumptions as fact and not considering that that I was maybe only accurate like 30% of the time. Like, I didn't know some of those things. And so I was operating with this confidence that I knew empathy, but other people didn't. And I think that is a really critical, those people have to unlearn their skills in addition to learning the new ones. And that can be really hard. So this book is not just for people who feel like they're not good with empathy, because I think it's dangerous to go down the narrative path of the world will be fixed if all of the software developers just learned how to have empathy. That's false. Like, we all need to learn this. This is not just like one role or one personality type. So the second is the competitive convincers who think that empathy is a debate, where empathy is about you understanding me. Empathy is about me trying to share a point of view and you adopting it. That's not empathy, right? Because it's like, why can't you just have more empathy for me, right? And I hear that a lot. And so empathy is kind of letting your guard down a little bit, recognizing that it's not a debate. Debate drives disconnection, and kind of allowing yourself to be a little bit vulnerable and learn. And that's how we're going to kind of move forward in some of these. And then the last one is the discouraged self-doubters. So these are the people who believe that they lack empathy, but it doesn't mean that your empathic ability is absent. I mean, even the mode now is that it's, 20 years ago it was seen as like, oh, certain populations don't have empathy. But now it's like, no, there's kind of deficits in particular skills, or like a condition is like alexithymia, where it's like really hard to like name an emotion, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't have empathy. It means that there is a skill that makes that more challenging. But when you learn how to operate as a team, and when you're building relationships, and when other people have empathy for you and say, how can I build this relationship with you in this way, right? But being able to name that and know that about yourself and describe it, like, that's how we get to this state. So it's not just the group that kind of people think of, although, that's somebody who I definitely hope it benefits. But I really want this to be more of a systemic impact, because it's everyone's responsibility. If you're writing things and if you're operating in a technical capacity, this is an essential skill, and treating it as a technical skill and not a soft skill, but a software skill. Then we start to realize some of the benefits of cleaner code and well-maintained code, and code that's easier to ship, code that's easier to market, code that is more equitable, just, and fair, code that's a joy to work with, teams that are a joy to work with, going home feeling like you're actually doing something meaningful instead of just being a ticket taker. And all of those things have their roots in learning to operate with a little bit more empathy.
Wow. Thank you so much for like digging deep into like kind of thinking about your audiences for your book. I also understand that you have some courses that you're working on as well.
Yes, they actually just launched.
Awesome.
So I'm so excited. So yeah, empathy in software has been something I've been exploring for a decade, but since I got the book deal, it's been diving deep into this research. And so I'm really excited now because I'm able to share it. So if you go to Heartware.dev, that's where we're using the courses. And so it's a 2-part series, and it's long because there's a lot here, right? So it's 2 4 full day events. So, but if you have some professional development or things like that, we're going to plan on having these kind of once a quarter in terms of the live events that I teach. And then we're hopefully in the next year or so, we'll be able to introduce kind of more of a self-paced course as well. And then of course the book. So there's a lot here, and I think that it's useful, but what I want people to walk away with is just feeling empowered, and like you have way more choice and you have way more control than you may have thought you had. And so being able to kind of guide that in a deeply technical way, instead of just putting a veneer on, and I call it throwing empathy confetti, where it's like, empathy is amazing, yay, yay, yay. But like, how do we actually do it? Like looking at it schematically. I'm excited.
That sounds awesome. I'm definitely include links to that in the show notes for our listeners. And is there a non-technical, non-software programming developer book that you find yourself recommending to peers often?
Ooh, that is a good one. I recommend a lot of books. I think I'm going to say the one that's right behind me. So Nedra Glover-Twaib, she has a book called Set Boundaries, Find Peace. And just like boundaries are so critical in software architecture for well-maintained code, boundaries actually have a huge impact on empathy as well. And being able to set and maintain healthy personal boundaries, like you can't have empathy without that skill. And I think that is the skill that people who identify as empaths have let go of. They have very, very porous boundaries. Other people might have really, really rigid boundaries. So being able to kind of negotiate boundaries and looking at that gives you a lot of skills, right within that. Yeah, it's just like crazy practical advice. I mean, it feels like a technical manual for how to set healthy boundaries. And it's a book that like I have been wanting to have published for a decade. And it came out last year. I was just like, yay. So
excellent. That sounds like a good one to pick up. I'm going to go order that myself later. Because part of when you were talking in this conversation, I was reflecting a little bit on people that felt like I hadn't been empathetic with them enough, but I've also have set boundaries where I'm like, I can't interact with you. I can't work with you. This is not like, and it's like just being open. I had a number of years of therapy to deal with that particular topic, because it was a business related thing that happened. But eventually as like light went off my head, I'm like, we just can't, it's not going to work between us. So I just needed to like establish boundaries and just accept that. But for a long time, I was feeling really guilty. I'm like, if I could just level up at being more understanding of that person and where they're, then maybe we would figure these things out, because they felt like they were doing a good job of trying to convey that I was such a horrible person at being empathetic towards them or their situation, but it was impacting work stuff. And so boundaries were really helpful. And I've since like forgiven myself and like, and it's not that I haven't stopped trying to get better. I'm just like, well, I don't have to keep beating that dead horse.
Well, I think this comes down to that, like, everyone is doing their best. Everyone is doing their best in every situation, and that includes you. And even if you've had mistakes in the past, it's not too late to own up to them and try learning new skills and moving towards something different. Yeah, I have the same thing. Like, and mine goes the opposite. Like I'm like overly understanding, and like, so for me, and what's the interesting correlation there is that if you have too much empathic concern where you get sucked into other people's, experience, and like you don't have a good sense of self while you're operating with empathy, it can actually cause ethical problems, because you get so wrapped up in one person's story that you forget the impact on a broader level. You have to have both. Empathy is about being pragmatic and balanced. It's balancing your needs and the needs of others and the needs of a system, right? It's balancing the emotions and the rational part of your brain. There's a lot there, but it's about balance. And that's why I think that technical colloquial version, like empathy, is not getting lost in other people, right? It's setting clear boundaries. It's understanding your own needs. It's negotiating. It's working to understand other people, and at the same time, like communicating really effectively. I could talk about this for days, which is why I had the course.
It sounds like that. And I feel like I could just keep throwing questions at you all day, but we got to get people back to their dog walks that are listening to their podcast right now.
That's exactly what I did this morning to get here to my office. Yes.
Nice. What's your pups' names?
I have a puppy named Yuki. She is white and fluffy, and she blends into the pillows on my couch, and I think it's hilarious. So,
oh, so maybe we can get a link to a photo of Yuki in the show notes as well. It's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Andrea. Thank you so much for talking shop with us today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.